This is Scott Morrison, one of Australia's least popular ever Prime Ministers. But this footage I'm playing you comes from the 2021 G7 summit. You see right here, Morrison approached Boris Johnson with an idea. What if Australia abandoned their $90 billion deal to have the French build them submarines and instead gave the contract to Britain and America? Just 5 years before, this would have been diplomatic suicide on Morrison's part. But now, not only did Morrison not have to worry about London ratting them out to Paris, but Brexit gave him the belief that the UK might just go for this. For Johnson, this was his chance to rebuild the empire.
This is a scandal. What did Boris do to my empire? Why are we about to collapse?
Now, based off of the title, I'm willing to guess you're thinking, how is it a bad thing to see the fall of the British Empire? Well, I'm not arguing on moral terms. The reality is that the British never set out to ruin their empire, yet today, no one knows their role in the world. This right here is a map of the British Empire at the end of World War II. By 1985, it would look like this. Their head start as being the first nation to industrialize was over, and World War II had well and truly exposed the fact that other nations had surpassed their ability to manufacture. Like dominoes, country after country claimed their independence. Given many British corporations had profited from cheap colonial resources, their own private empires were in grave danger. If they were to keep their wealth, they needed to adapt fast.
As you can see right here, we have the Cayman Islands. If you want your money tax-free, plonk it right here.
So, a lot of pop culture references are made to the Cayman Islands.
Off to the Cayman Islands then, huh?
As soon as I get my money.
What you might not know is the history behind islands like these. You see these lines that I'm drawing right here are a city within a city. We call this the City of London, which is different to the broader city. They have their own Lord Mayor and contain the most important financial institutions in England. They were so powerful that post-war leader Clement Attlee actually accused them of dictating foreign policy. And as the British Empire was falling, UK bankers rushed to set up branches in the falling dominoes. In these offshore jurisdictions, the new government would not have to directly answer to London, but would offer extremely low taxes and even no formal registry of trusts. When the British government was questioned on allowing this, their answer has always been,
We don't interfere in offshore jurisdictions.
And so, despite leaving the colonies, the exploitation didn't stop. These tax havens have been so alluring for the developing world that over $1 trillion of tax revenue has been lost to these accounts. For the City of London, this was great. They'd positioned themselves as the world's bankers. For the British government, it was a disaster. The low taxes meant they generated no revenue from this, and manufacturing was making up a rapidly smaller percentage of their GDP. During World War II, the biggest manufacturers were America and the Soviets, the two who had the biggest impact on the war. Effectively, Britain was selling off its influence, and in the 60s it needed to reassess.
Now on, the pound abroad is worth 14% or so less in terms of other currencies.
From 1960 to 1967, exports as a percentage of GDP dropped by 4 points. To counter this, Harold Wilson announced the devaluing of the pound from US $2.80 to $2.40. With it now cheaper to import from the UK, the manufacturing industry was thrown the smallest of lifelines. But Britain had to face a huge issue. It had lost its territory, and it had now just about lost its manufacturing capacity. If they weren't careful, they were about to lose their influence. Now, by 1972, Britain's primary ties were with America and the broader Commonwealth. If you look at the map, you can see the huge issue. These weren't locals and didn't necessarily have the same collective security interests. Instead, in the midst of the Cold War, these guys would be pretty crucial partners. Now Britain had applied to join the European communities, the old name for the EU, for over a decade, but French President Charles de Gaulle had held it up. The European communities had 3 key communities. Think of them as subreddits. The first was a common market for nuclear energy, Euratom. Member states would supply each other nuclear energy, with the non-member states only then able to access a surplus of energy. The second was a coal community, which enforced free movement of coal between member states and consequences for if a country favored its own coal industry. And the third was the economic community, which ensured free movement of goods, services, and people across all member states. Sure, the French Empire might have fallen, but France was certainly quick in downsizing and still exercising power in its backyard. Those powers being policing these European communities that had a half dozen members. While the French had adapted, the British had nothing to show for its post-World War II era, apart from the City of London getting filthy rich by managing the world's finances. If Britain was going to maintain any relevance, it needed to get into the European communities. In 1972, Europe accepted Britain's application, but surprise, surprise, Nigel Farage wasn't the first one to take issue with the EU.
Whoa, hold up there, Mr. M. I am Mr. Brexit. I'm starting a channel called Mr. Brexit History.
Oh, and you'd have zero complaints from me on that front. But yes, the reaction to Britain getting accepted was pretty mixed. So much so that Wilson actually put it to a referendum in 1975. In fact, a lot of his own Labour Party campaigned for no out of a desire to protect manufacturing jobs. If the European communities didn't let you protect your industries with things like big subsidies and tariffs, more manufacturing jobs would be shipped off overseas. And this is me editorializing here. From a purely imperial point of view, those jobs had really left a decade before and was a necessary sacrifice in keeping Britain relevant in its own area, particularly as the Commonwealth had lost Ireland, South Africa, and Pakistan. The result was a fairly comfortable yes. In the 1980s, just about most of its manufacturing capacity was lost. In 1976, manufacturing made up 30% of its GDP. By 1988, that dropped to 22%. With the EU preventing protectionist policies and Thatcher's Big Bang allowing foreign banks into the UK, which increased the financial services proportion of the economy. None of Britain's power was in its ability to produce. Take away the City of London, and Britain's only real power was soft power. The world spoke their language, and they were relational glue between other countries. By the end of the Thatcher major years, Britain was becoming completely irrelevant. But then the Blair years happened.
I am deeply proud and privileged to stand before you as the new Labour Prime Minister of this country.
So obviously when you think of Blair's foreign policy, you think of Iraq. Well, actually that's probably not obvious to my 12 to 16-year-old audience, so here's Mr. Beast to explain it.
So Tony Blair and George Bush invaded from here to here with one warning. Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. Of course he didn't.
But we've got to remember that for the first half of Blair's reign, people not only loved him, but loved his foreign policy. You see, under Blair, Britain actually leveraged other countries. In 1999, he essentially pressured Clinton into having NATO support the Kosovo Liberation Army against Yugoslavia, which led to them negotiating a settlement. In 2000, British intervention in Sierra Leone helped stop an endless cycle of military coups. And pardon the pun, but the crown jewel was mediating the Good Friday truce between Irish paramilitaries and British Unionists. Make no mistake, under Blair, Britain was making use of every ounce of facilitating power, and Blair himself was very good at redirecting both Clinton and Bush. But from 2003 onwards, Britain's relationship with the outside became extremely strained. So there was division within the EU as France vehemently opposed the invasion of Iraq. Then in 2008, the GFC hit, of which Britain came out far from blameless.
Welcome back to Piers Morgan tonight. First up, did Harry and Meghan cause the GFC? Well, actually, yes.
That's probably a little far, but you know how I said Britain's economy was largely based on banking? Well, what's interesting is what types of banks they have. 82% of Britain's banks are commercial banks, so banks that fund mortgages rather than, say, small businesses. Just for perspective, France's share is 45%, while Germany's is 36%. What this meant was that British banks were amongst the key traders in the US mortgage market, buying Americans' mortgages off of US banks at discounted rates. And because these initial US banks didn't have to deal with the fallout of someone defaulting on their mortgage, they signed them up for ridiculous loans that they could never repay. Because of this, some have said that British banks were responsible for turning the subprime mortgage crisis of 2008 into a global financial crisis. It's hard to overstate how hard it hit the UK as one of its biggest banks. Northern Rock needed bailing out from the government before then failing anyway. By the mid-2010s, it was clear that Blair's initial attempt to revive British influence in the world had failed. But then, of course, Brexit came.
People want to know what Brexit will mean.
Brexit means
Brexit.
Now, I know by even mentioning Brexit, the retention of this video is about to drop, so I'm not going to rehash the debate. The crux of the issue was, should Britain govern in partnership with Europe or as a sole trader? Obviously, they chose the latter. Let me know in the comments, would you have voted yes or no? Now again, Brexit had really been happening for years before 2016. After all, Blair defied most of Europe to go ahead with Iraq. But now, it was no longer going to be a local trade facilitator alongside France and Germany. If Britain wasn't able to exert influence locally, it'd have to go looking for partners elsewhere. And if they weren't going to be in Europe, that'd mean going back to its 50s foreign policy. Except, there'd be one key difference. After Brexit, the UK's industrial output stood at just 9% of its GDP. So if it was going to have any influence in the world, that 9% had to be of incredible value. In 2016, Britain's military expenditure, at least as a percentage of its GDP, was at an all-time low. Since then, we've slowly seen that creep back up. What's also important is a measurement called TIV, Trend Indicator Value.
Boring. Stop with all these stats. You sound like Economics Explained.
Yeah, I don't even know what this channel is anymore. But TIV measures the military capability of weapons exports rather than their financial value. By this metric, Britain was the world's 7th largest arms exporter from 2018 to 2022, and this trend has matched their foreign policy. Post-Brexit, the clear shift that we've seen with Britain has been a push towards America. Now, responding to a growing China has been a delicate issue for pretty much all Western nations. Their security partner, America, has pushed for them to decouple their economy from China, but to do so would be very costly. This has meant that a lot of sensitivity has been required in responding to things like the Xinjiang conflict, where genocide against Uyghur Muslims has been reported. In terms of trying to understand the difference, what we're looking for is not necessarily do they condemn China or not. Western nations just about all do. But their foreign policy is revealed in how far they go with that condemnation.
We do have serious concerns. We have concerns about the treatment of the Uyghur minority, obviously about the human rights abuses. We obviously have concerns about what's happening in Hong Kong, and you'll be hearing a bit later on from the Foreign Secretary about how we're going to change our extradition arrangements to reflect our concerns about what's happening with the security law in Hong Kong. We have to think about the human rights, the rights of the people of Hong Kong to participate in democratic processes, and people here from Hong Kong, and how those changes affect them.
And the Uyghur issue actually revealed a growing split between the EU and the UK. So for context, Trump's passing gift to Biden in 2021 was to label China's actions as a genocide, and this was kind of also a litmus test as to where the rest of the world stood. Pretty much none of Africa supported it. Canada and New Zealand opted against using the word genocide, and the EU only went as far as saying China was at risk of genocide. Diplomatically, they just signed the EU-China trade agreement, which meant greater access to the Chinese market. And so Germany, for instance, were importing 1.55 times the amount from China that the UK was, despite having only 1.22 times the population of Britain. Not to mention that the Belt and Road has plenty of EU partners, and so the EU simply has more skin in the game when it comes to China. As a result, they're taking a more neutral approach. The same certainly cannot be said for the British. In response to Xinjiang, the House of Commons unanimously declared it a genocide and then made moves to not only help contain China, but bolster its position as a powerful arms manufacturer. So in 2021, both the UK and Australia's submarines were nearing the end of their cycles and were in need of replacement. Now Australia signed up first to have Japan build their replacement, but then ditched them for the French. Having already spent $2 billion building the fleet, Australia then ditched the French to have America and the UK build the subs for them. Now technically, the deal is that Australia will build 8 nuclear submarines by 2040 for around $260 to $360 billion. However, Australia is a listed non-nuclear member of the International Atomic Agency. That means it has to get sealed nuclear fuel and components imported from both America and the UK, and then have the UK train Australia in how to actually operate the sub. So clearly then, in terms of Britain's sphere of influence, it seems to be very much playing the role of America's right-hand man and an enforcer.
If Putin was a woman, which he obviously isn't, but if he were,
I really don't think he would have embarked on a crazy, macho war of invasion and violence in the way that he has. If you want a perfect example of toxic masculinity, it's what he's doing in Ukraine.
So again, Ukraine provided another fascinating divide between the foreign policies of Britain and Europe. Of course, both were scathing of Putin and provided weapons to Ukraine, but Britain was particularly insistent on not negotiating with him. Putin has accused Boris Johnson of torpedoing negotiations for a peace deal in April of 2022, and this was supported by a pro-Western Ukrainian newspaper, Ukrainska Pravda, but I'd still wait for the dust to settle before taking that as gospel. What at least seems to be fairly well documented was that Boris Johnson called Putin a war criminal that shouldn't be negotiated with. Whether that actually torpedoed the talks is another thing. Now, I'm going to avoid the whole proxy war debate, but America clearly wants to weaken Russia's sphere of influence in Europe, and so once again, Britain has proven itself to be a crucial right-hand man on the ground in Europe. So make no mistake, Britain was very much at risk of becoming the Venice of the 21st century by selling away their influence. But in the last decade, what we've instead seen is them becoming something like what the Kingdom of Armenia was to the Romans, an effective regional ally to a preeminent superpower in the world, Uncle Sam. But remember, there was a third member in the AUKUS deal, ScoMo. He's widely regarded as amongst Australia's least popular prime ministers of all time. Find out why by clicking here.